On November 11, 2024, participants from nearly 200 countries met in Baku, Azerbaijan, at the invitation of the United Nations for the UN Climate Change Conference, or COP29. COP29 brought together world leaders and negotiators from the member states or parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. In the UN's own words, one of the key priorities of COP29 was to secure a new goal on climate finance, ensuring every country has the means to take much stronger climate action, slashing greenhouse gas emissions and building resilient communities. Economists and climate activists told the UN talks that developing countries need at least $1 trillion US annually by 2035. The final amount agreed to at COP29 was $300 billion US annually by the year 2035. Caroline Brouillette, the Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada, has just returned from Baku, and in this interview on December the 4th, 2024, responds to 5 questions about COP29.
COP29 was a truly difficult COP. Many observers who have been at many of those said it was the worst COP in years. That is not only because of the outcome and the fact that the deal on the long-term climate finance goal is extremely disappointing and far below countries in the Global South's needs, but also because of the process itself and how the presidency, who called oil and gas a gift of God, conducted the negotiations and left little space for there to be constructive discussions between countries, and as well repressed civic space and our participation as civil society too. The deal that was achieved in Baku is a band-aid on a bullet wound, as the world's bleeding in this year, which has been the hottest on record, continues to intensify in its bleeding, to use a metaphor. We saw a deal achieved where not only in terms of quantity, $300 billion is way below the needs of countries in the Global South, which have been telling us can be counted in trillions, but also in terms of the quality of the goal. There are no lessons that have been learned in terms of the type of financing that has been included in this deal, including the fact that it will still likely be mostly in the form of loans, contributing to exacerbating the crushing debt levels that countries in the Global South face, as well as mixing together public and private finance, failing to delineate what funding goes to mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And so, unfortunately, this is an extremely disappointing COP outcome. The Paris Agreement at its core was a compromise. It was a compromise between the additional efforts needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees and the fact that resources, finance namely, would be necessary for countries who are in the front lines of the climate crisis. The poorest and most vulnerable countries would need not only for this transition to be fair, but also for it to be feasible. And so we have our work cut up for us as we try to show that this $300 billion goal is is the floor, not the ceiling, for ambition, because for countries to come up with climate plans, which are due by the beginning of next year, that truly meet the moment and get us to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, a lot more resources will be needed. Now that we're back in Canada, the question is, how does our country do its fair share of the global effort to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, given that Canada has a large historical responsibility for the crisis that we're in? And so we're looking to Canada's next nationally determined contribution or target for 2035, which must show a level of ambition that is commensurate with our responsibility in the crisis, as well as putting money on the table to make this new goal as paltry a sum as it is a reality. Countries will need to show us the money, and so that's what we're expecting Canada to do in its next climate finance commitment. Climate change is a nonpartisan issue, and it's very unfortunate to see right now in our country some politicians being faced with one of the gravest crises ever seen, one that really threatens their constituents' livelihoods, and instead of telling us what they are going to do about it, just suggesting that we do less. So we have a big issue here, and that issue is highly political. It's one where we see a handful of people, a handful of wealthy fossil fuel interests really capture our policy making and political processes while raking in record profits. And that is the core of what we have to tackle if we are to see Canada do its fair share of the global effort to limit warming to 1.5 degrees.